That's good. That was a lot of fun. Okay, so we ended the last lecture on the topic of football, collective behavior in football. So today we're going to mostly stick with humans and think about collective behavior with humans. And it's going to be no equations. We're going to take it slow. And by all means, just interject at any point. Okay, so this, of course, is the human brain. Oh, let's see if we can fix that. Thank you very much. As we discussed, humans are capable of a variety of very complex cognitive processes. But when we're in crowds, if you recall this video that I showed you before, we can be remarkably predictable. And so today, a lot of what we're going to discuss is about how opinions form, how individuals change each other's opinions, how you're influenced by others without necessarily even knowing that you are being influenced. So one of the projects that we worked on was prior to the London Olympics. There was a lot of concern about the potential for terrorism, especially in large crowded places. This is a main railway station in London. And so we had the opportunity to work with the British security services to try to understand whether we can predict when suspicious behavior occurs. Because as I mentioned before, people will tend to detect suspicious behavior. They're very good at doing so, but are very unlikely to actually intervene and do anything about it. This is called bystander apathy. So we worked with computer vision experts at Oxford to develop software that allowed us to track roughly, approximately, the head motions of individuals. And importantly, of course, the data are anonymized. It's not a high enough resolution for people to recognize others. But in all honesty, probably it would be impossible to get permission to do this type of experiment now due to those privacy issues. We also worked on a shopping street in Oxford where we could have actors within the crowd performing suspicious activity. And then we could observe how others reacted to them. I'm just going to move this down a little bit. And as I mentioned, we also worked in a main railway station in London. So different scenarios, but both crowded environments, one a busy shopping street, one a busy train station. And what we found was only relatively slight effect of people increasing their probability of looking at suspicious individuals. So they did look at these individuals more than they looked at others, but only over relatively close distances, and it's not a massive effect. However, in the railway station, we got a much stronger behavioral response, but it's inverted. Now individuals are much less likely to look at suspicious individuals than they would to non-suspicious individuals in this crowd. Now, what I think is probably happening here is that due to limited sample sizes and so on, and because we were informed that most terrorists tend to be male, we only used male actors in our experiments. And so it could be that men tend to avert their gaze from suspicious individuals because it's potentially a sign of conflict if you're looking directly at males. And it was a male-dominated crowd in the morning in the train station. And so if we looked at the we estimated whether the pedestrians were male or female, and you could see that in the shopping street, both males and females tended to look at the suspicious individuals more often. But you can see the density is much lower. Now, when we looked at the train station, females behaved in very much the same way. They would tend to look more often at the suspicious individuals, but the males tended to look much, much less. So that's what we think is probably happening here, is that the males are perhaps looking at the corner of their eye, which is something we can't detect with this technology. And social influence impacts every aspect of our lives. It impacts your family life, it impacts your work life, it also impacts dating. So in this experiment, the researchers were interested in how women would view a male's attractiveness dependent on who their apparent partner was. So the males are paired with a woman, and they appear to, again, these are actors, and they appear to be dating. And then the women are judging the men's attractiveness. And if the man's initial attractiveness is objectively low, so you can get a cohort of women to assess the attractiveness of these men in the absence of any social stimulus, so you can objectively tell whether the men are of low, medium, or high attractiveness. But if the man is of low attractiveness, objectively low attractiveness, but he's seen with an attractive woman, he is subconsciously perceived as being more attractive than otherwise. And again, it's really a very strong effect. They did not do this experiment in reverse. So it's always just women assessing men's attractiveness in this particular study. The effect persists for medium and high attractive men, but the effect is much less strong because if you're already very attractive, there's not really far that you can move one way or the other in that respect. So even in terms of something we would think is quite objective, like how attractive you find someone, is subconsciously very strongly influenced by others. And this is really common in nature as well, in the animal world, where mate choice copying is a very, very strong effect. Females can even reverse their preference in experiments if you make it appear as if the male fish or bird or whatever is attractive to others. So people have a very, very strong effect here. Any questions so far? Everyone's quiet and dazed today. We might get through the material a little bit too quickly at this rate. Yeah.
So, just in the previous experiment, so I understood correctly, in the first experiment, the suspicious individual is just some actor that you produce to kind of.
So
what do you do to make them particularly suspicious so that we would expect them to be?
Yeah. So I always say main railway station in London. I'm not allowed to tell you which train station it was, and I'm also not allowed to tell you details about the stimulus. But in actual fact, we had access to the 7/7 bombings in London, the underground bombings. We had access to the surveillance videos, and there's a lot of surveillance videos in London. And so we were also informed by the MI5, by the security services, what they perceived as being the most typical behaviors on reconnaissance, terrorist reconnaissance. So I can't.
Suspicious according to this,
Yeah.
agency, not according to human behavior.
It's hard for me to talk about it because so there were certain things that we did that we couldn't publish, and there were certain things that we could publish, but I have to be quite careful about saying too much. It was fascinating actually working with these security services. I mean, on one occasion, this isn't being recorded, is it? There's no.
It is.
It is? Okay, I'll be quiet. I can tell you later. And in a similar type of experiment, again, this is now a much more artificial situation, but it even persists into these artificial situations. So again, the challenge is to estimate the attractiveness of this man. And what they did is they changed the perceived emotional state of a female that's not even, you can tell she's not even looking at him, it's two different pictures. But even though it's this simple, it still elicits a strong response. And women would find the man much more attractive if the woman is smiling, if she seems to be favoring him. Men, however, exhibited the opposite response. And again, it's not possible to really know why. Perhaps this is spite or jealousy or something like that. Again, they did not do the experiments in reverse. So there's lots of ways in which we're influenced by each other. So these are sort of very short timescale subconscious behaviors. But of course, there are fads and fashions throughout the ages that are strongly socially influenced. The 80s was a particularly interesting time for such fads and fashions. And so again, you know, people tend to conform to what others are wearing, to what others are doing. And of course, fashion, once something becomes very popular, it's potentially no longer interesting. And so something new comes in or something old comes back. So it seems to be something that's really kind of pre-programmed in us to have this tendency to copy those around. Or, of course, you can get movements like punk and so on that deliberately, you know, they have their own uniform, so to speak, but deliberately tries to antagonize the tradition. Until, of course, that then becomes too popular, and then it's, you know, embedded in sort of mainstream fashion itself. Markets are very strongly socially influenced. You know, before the advent of algorithmic trading, people, you know, traders used to send each other messages. They had a messaging service. They still do have messaging services. They used to call each other, send messages, and really the mood of the traders was very, very important. And many of the stock market crashes were really this sudden transmission of information. I mean, and you can have this social phenomenon where suddenly panic sets in, and you get aberrant behavior. Politics. You know, again, it's hugely socially influenced. We were just discussing it yesterday and also during some of the lunches about what's going on in Brazil and the different movements and the factions and the polarity that forms within modern societies, and that's something I'll come back to. I find it quite interesting in the case of Trump, because he is objectively bad. I mean, the things he has said himself, I mean, just about himself is so horrific, and yet he managed to be elected and may run again unless he's put in prison. What about literature? Has anyone read this book? Yeah, most of you? So, have you ever thought, what would happen if you could reverse time? Would this book still be on the bookshelves or not? You know, how much is dependent on chance, and how much is dependent on the fact that this, I mean, I personally don't think this is a very well written book. I think it's entertaining, but it's not very well written. And it was rejected by 8 publishers. So it had a very high probability of never actually making it to the market. And even if it did make it to the market, you know, what's the probability that it would have become this incredible success? And it's not just this book. There are many examples. Star Wars, for example. If you haven't seen it, you've probably heard of it. If you haven't heard of it, there's something wrong with you. But it was rejected by the main movie houses. It was also panned by the critics when it came out. It got terrible reviews. And now it's a billion-dollar, probably multi-billion-dollar franchise. You know, so again, it may not have happened. And you know, our culture would have changed because something else may have popped up. So I often think about, you know, if you reverse time and ran it forwards again, you know, how similar would life be? Would Trump be in power? Would, you know, many things may not have happened. Or alternatively, things could have been much worse. It's really hard to know. So how would you expect social influence to change inequality or predictability if you could do this miraculous sort of reversing time? There's a very cool experiment by Matt Salganik, who's at Princeton now, but he did this experiment when he was at Columbia University with Duncan Watts. And they set up a website called Music Lab with free music downloads. Now, I'll show you a list of the bands. So if you've got good enough eyesight, you can see the names of the bands. And I'm pretty sure that you will not recognize any of these bands. And this was deliberate. So these were unsigned artists. The reason they didn't want you to have already heard them is that you would have a prior. You would have a belief as to whether you liked them or not. So it was important that it was really novel music that you were hearing. And then, like in iTunes or like in Amazon or many things that we use today, there was also a rating for the song. I love it, I like it, it's okay, I don't like it, and I hate it. Right? So you could rate the songs. Now, the cool thing that they did was they registered the IP address of the computer. So whenever you logged in, unbeknown to you, you were put into one of alternative worlds with a whole cohort of other people, hundreds and hundreds of other people. And so basically, they were running the same type of experiment, like would the same songs become popular if you have a sort of chart, a ranking of the songs, if you have these different worlds in it. And also they looked at the scenario where you did not have access to other people's opinion. You could only listen to the song and rate it yourself. You couldn't see anyone else's ratings. And so they use ratings all the time. And we use it too, right? You don't buy something if it's got a low rating. You think it's a proxy for quality or for reliability. But is it? You know, so this is one of the only experiments I know of where they've actually tested that. So you would perhaps predict that in the worlds where you can share social information, the rankings will be very similar to each other because you've got this shared information among people within the population. And so you had these 8 different worlds, sort of parallel universes, so to speak, and you could compare to see how they. Yep.
The world is the different sets of music. They each.
No, everyone has access to exactly the same music. Okay. These are different populations of people. Okay. Right. So it's like running history again and again and again. Right, so this is so annoying. I think it's me maybe. By registering the IP address, unbeknown to you, you were randomly allocated to world 1 to 8. But when you logged in again, you always went to world 1 to 8, the same world that you were allocated to, along with 1,000 other people, say. And then a different 1,000 people would be in world 2, a different 1,000 people in world 3, and so on.
Of interaction the people in each of those worlds had? They couldn't see each other's opinions about this?
They can. So in these worlds, they can all see the opinions of other individuals. Oh. And then they can have a large cohort, an independent condition, where individuals cannot see. So then you get the independent estimates of the quality of the songs without the social influence. So in each of these worlds, there's the social influence, there's the ranking. You can see the ranking of others. At least, I can't exactly remember how they did it. It's probably like the average or whatever ranking of others. And here there's no ranking. And this is just not to really take note of the figures so much, but if you want to have a look at this paper, it's a really wonderful paper. But this is just showing the ranking in the independent world and the ranking in the world, one of the worlds, where there's social influence. Now, if the independent world and the world in which you have others' opinions, it should be really one-to-one, right? The good songs should be ranked as good songs, the poor songs should be ranked as poor songs. And you can see there's a clustering at the top here, and a cluster at the bottom. And that shows you that the very best songs did tend to be correlated. The very worst songs did tend to be correlated. But look across this whole middle ground. There's massive variation. Some songs that were number 1, for example, in one of the worlds, in the independent ranking, it was actually a very average song. So how could it have got to number 1? So what they showed was that increasing the strength of social influence, increasing your access to the ratings of other individuals, increases the inequality of success and the unpredictability of success. So why do you think that may be?
Maybe you can have some kind of ripple effect where the initial opinions of a few people end up influencing many others.
Exactly right. That's exactly what's going on here. So just by, and of course the influence of those first individuals could be kind of stochastic inherently because it's relatively few individuals. And this is why on Amazon, especially when it was a bookstore, the first reviews were always written by family and friends. They would load the reviews with high-ranking reviews because people had an instinct that this sort of thing is important, right? It gives you that initial advantage. And this has also been shown very heavily in the scientific literature. Yes, if you discover the structure of DNA, that's going to be a very important paper. But the vast majority of the science that we do is not going to be hopefully terrible or Nobel Prize winning. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. And that, unfortunately, tends to have a very strong effect of the rich get richer. You know, when I was at the University of Leeds, I never got invited to shit. No one invited me to any conferences or anything. As soon as I moved to Princeton, no change in my science. Suddenly I was invited to lots of places, and there's now very strong evidence that this sort of heritage, the status of the university you're at plays a massive role. And of course that leads to a runaway effect. As soon as people start paying attention to your papers, they start being cited. The more you're cited, the more you're likely to be cited in future. Yeah? And it's not a good thing, because it can lead to this huge unfairness in the majority of the population, especially early on in one's career, which is the most important time. Okay, so again, yeah.
I saw that they had a sign saying that the person don't need to listen to the whole song. Did they add anything to measure if the person actually listened to
I can't remember that level of detail. But there was an incentive to listen to the song because you could then download it for free.
No, because I was thinking that if you can see the reviews and they are really bad reviews, you are less likely to hear the whole thing. You just
It's a great question.
hear a little bit and then you're, oh,
Yeah, I haven't read the paper for many years, so I don't know that detail, but it's a great question. And I wonder whether they have those data, because you're absolutely right. I mean, are you really going to punish yourself by finishing a song that you've already decided you hate? Or do you listen longer to an objectively bad song because it's got a good rating? These are good things to ask, and I don't know whether they did that. I'd have to relook at the paper. Was there another question at the back?
Just to add an example that I remember that I read, I don't remember, but it's a famous song for worldwide that were introduced into the population. I don't know. Okay.
Maybe we could maybe if we turn the volume down a little bit.
Yes.
This, I think that might help. I don't know. Is it this one here, the bottom, or the top?
You can use that or the analog dials that there are inside this metal cabinet.
Okay, I turned it. Where is that?
Yes.
Okay, that sounds better,
yes,
doesn't it?
perfect, yes. So what they do to do that was to introduce this song that they want to promote, to advertise between two songs that were really popular. So the people that start to hate it, that the people that hear that.
Maybe I'll stand back.
The people who listen the song for the first time, they hate it. They say, oh, what is this? Why is this feeling, the rhythm? And what they do was to try to do this repeatedly in the radios. And that's how we born I don't know how to say it in English, but in Colombia, it's como la but when you pay for the song to be in a radio station, everything understand in this way.
Yeah, and I guess it's the same with things like jingles for advertising. They play it so often that it just becomes, you know, sometimes you find yourself humming like McDonald's jingle, you hate yourself for it. But it's, you know, if you play it enough, then it just, you know, it becomes familiar. Yeah, it's an interesting point. And so this painting here, you've probably heard of this painting. Has anyone seen it in the real world? What was it like to see it?
Very small,
Yeah.
and it's in a room that there is a lot like paintings that are the size of the wall.
Yeah.
And there's this tiny painting that is a huge line with people to take a picture
Yes.
by the side.
So have you ever thought about this painting as to whether it's actually good? I mean, it's not bad. I'm not saying it's bad, but he was an absolute master. Is this his best work? Why is this more famous than his other works?
He liked it.
Pardon?
He liked it a lot.
He liked it? No, he didn't like it. He gave it away, in fact. Yes. So this is what people say. It's like, you know, that it's this ambiguous smile, right? But when did that happen? When did people start saying that? Was that 200 years ago? So it's interesting to think about, right? Because we just think it must be good, and therefore we come up with a reason, like the smile, that's why it's so appealing. But that's not true. In fact, it was a very little known painting until quite recently. And this is what you typically experience. So I guess it's even worse now. There's no cell phones here, so this must be a while ago. Maybe it's even worse these days. But yeah, it's this small painting. The reason it's famous is that it was stolen in 1911. It was a very little known painting. And it was stolen, and suddenly, that of course was in all of the papers, all the cafes in Paris, they were talking about it. And not only that, but Pablo Picasso was implicated. So this is a good story, right? This is scandalous, this is gossip, this is exciting. So this was globally the top news story of its time. But in actual fact, it was stolen by a janitor who was Italian and wanted to return the painting to Italy with the mistaken belief that it had been stolen from Italy. In fact, it had been given to Italy. And then, of course, it had been given to France, sorry. And so it's actually quite a boring story. He just hid it in a closet and then walked out with it. That's it. And that was enough for it suddenly, when it was returned, it became incredibly famous. And then once it was already famous, it became more famous and more famous and more famous. And now people have forgotten why it was famous, and they come up with stories about her smile. This is sometimes called the Justin Timberlake effect. At least it was called this by the New York Times, where someone who produces very average music can reach the top of the charts. It's also called cumulative advantage, or the Matthew effect. Poor Justin Timberlake, but it's a fair point, with respect to his music at least. I hope there's no Justin Timberlake fans here that I'm offending. So there's this fun article by Duncan Watts, the senior author of that paper on the Music Lab. Is Justin Timberlake a product of cumulative advantage? Duncan told me that, in fact, he did not want this to be the title of the article. He included Justin Timberlake as an example in the thing, but the New York Times picked up on that, and I think it's quite funny. And so, you know, we live in this society where, as you've seen, you're influenced by, you know, who you find attractive. This then impacts who you date, which impacts who you have kids with, which impact, and of course you can influence your kids' behaviors as well. In fact, the amount of influence that parents have on their children is strongly debated. In some aspects, like sports interests and so on, it's actually relatively low. In other aspects, like political beliefs, it tends to be relatively high. But also, of course, people tend to hang out with and associate with people who have similar preferences to themselves. Right? So people with political views tend to associate with others with similar political views. And so we have this self-sorting within our societies. And this, of course, is also influenced by affluence and so on. So if you think about this Justin Timberlake effect, imagine you're born into riches like Donald Trump, who says he's a self-made man but was given tens of millions from his father. And it's not just that, the contacts that you have. You're born into this influential family. Or you're born into a slum in the city here. Right? These things really matter. They have huge effects. They're just the starting point that you get, the jump-off point, because of cumulative advantage. It's very hard to fail if you're born very rich. It's very hard to succeed if you're born very poor. In the middle, at least, there's some opportunity. And we often think, you know, you can think of yourself, oh, I'm successful because I worked hard, I deserve it, right? But realistically, there's a huge amount of chance and luck and lucky breaks that then completely change your life. And I think people really don't realize that huge variance in the middle that we saw with those songs actually perpetuates everything that we do. And so we should be very aware that it's not, you know, if someone does badly, it's not necessarily their fault at all. If someone does well, it's not necessarily because they're brilliant.
On that topic, I found it interesting, but recently, I think 1 year ago, or perhaps a little more, there's this Harvard professor who has a very famous course on justice and ethics, Iain Couzin, and he released a book about how meritocracy is perhaps one of the problems in American culture, and then everyone was talking about this. This brand new idea that we should perhaps wonder if that's right or not. Just remind me of that, because I found it very astonishing how much press was given to that, which is essentially something almost obvious in American culture that somehow offers challenges to try to find out.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, if you could share that with us, that would be excellent. So yes, we are complex. We are capable of amazing creativity, but there are these huge impacts of social influence. And we see this in our lives in a multitude of ways, some of them very positive, some of them very negative. So in relation to what I was just saying, what was just said at the moment ago about meritocracy, we're kind of obsessed with individuals and individual intelligence, individuals being great, right? You think of Steve Jobs as being this genius. Some people think of Elon Musk as being some sort of talisman of genius, where, you know, he's probably an idiot. But the point is this obsession with the individual I find quite strange, because almost everything we do in life, we've just seen how important social influence is, and almost everything we do in life is part of a team or part of a group. So it's quite rare for individuals to make decisions. It's more common for communities or groups to make decisions. And so individual intelligence, or generalized intelligence, came about from Spearman. Some of you may have heard Spearman before because of his statistical tests. So he was a statistician, and he was very interested in whether an individual being good at one thing could be good at another thing and good at another. Is there something generalizable about intelligence, or are there sort of more specialist forms of intelligence? And so this is now called, it was Spearman's G factor, but it's now more commonly known as IQ test. Right, so this is Charles Spearman. So again, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing to try to quantify individual intelligence and so on. I think it's what has to be done very, very carefully. I think some people are just very good at these types of tests and other people aren't, and it doesn't necessarily make them more or less intelligent. But nonetheless, so this general intelligence, also known as the G factor, refers to the existence of a broad mental capacity that influences performance on cognitive ability measures. So he first described this in 1904. And as you're probably well aware, people now talk about IQ a lot. People do IQ tests, and this is something that's very, very common. And it's this idea that there can be correlations between, say, reasoning, perceptual, spatial, verbal, and quantitative abilities. But what about in groups? So is a group's intelligence tending to be the average IQ of the individuals in the group? Or perhaps it's the highest IQ of the group that dominates, because they can pull other individuals up in group decision-making tasks. Again, this hadn't been tested until relatively recently. So is there evidence of something that's different to individual intelligence, a sort of collective intelligence? If so, can that be quantified? So can we isolate a small set of tasks that's then predictive of group performance on a broader range of more complex tasks? So it's basically what Spearman was doing in 1904, but now we're forward more than 100 years, and people are now starting to think about doing this with groups. Does it have a predictive validity beyond individual intelligence? Is it just the sum of the IQs? Is the whole just the sum of the parts? And I guess one of the reasons it hadn't been done before is that people did think that group intelligence was probably something like the average IQ or the highest IQ of the individuals without testing it. And how can we use this information to build a better science of human group decision-making? Again, not to read this, but this is just so you'll have, I can share the slides so you have the paper, so you can have a look at this paper if you like. And that's Anita Woolley, who's the first author. And I really like this work. So they wrote, by analogy with individual intelligence, we define a group's collective intelligence, C, as the general ability of the group to perform a wide variety of tasks. And here's just two. I think there were 11 tasks in the paper, if I recall correctly. And they were very diverse, like architectural design and video games, and you can see the paper for details. But what immediately appears here is that the average member intelligence and the maximum member intelligence does very poorly at explaining group performance compared to this collective intelligence factor that they'd uncovered. So we'll go into that in a little bit more detail as to why this is the case. 10 different tasks, not 11. Consistently, it was what they described as the group's collective intelligence that could explain their ability to perform tasks well. So you could not predict from putting a group together based on the IQs of the individuals whether it was going to be a good functioning, a well-functioning group, or a very poor functioning group. It did not relate to the maximum IQ or the average IQ. So what then does predict it? If it's not the IQ of the individuals? So as I said, it's not the average IQ of the members in the group. It's not the maximum IQ within the group. Also, it didn't correlate with the personality tests that they did of the individuals within the group. It wasn't related to the motivation of the members of the group to solve the task together. It wasn't related to the satisfaction they felt at the end of the task as to whether they felt they'd done a good or poor job. It was about communication. Groups in which one or a few people dominated the conversation performed very poorly. Those where communication was egalitarian and there was turn-taking performed really well. And how did they know this? Well, they put these badges on people that could record the voice. Now, you can't record what people say for privacy reasons, but you can record things like the tone of the voice, and you can certainly record how long that individual was communicating. And also, if someone is talking over somebody else, you can have access to that. And so the groups that performed well tended to be individuals that all approximately had the same amount of time talking and tended not to talk over each other, i.e. there was turn-taking in conversation. So nothing to do with IQ. It was about the communication within the group. I think this is absolutely remarkable, and it's a really, really strong effect. So we're just obsessed with the individual, IQ of individuals, or the CEO of companies, gets a lot of credit, and perhaps not necessarily fairly.
Could they compare, in this case, the groups in which all of the members had somewhat equal share of time saved, but in which one of the groups they interrupted each other and so that they could speak, and in the other one they took turns?
I don't know. I don't know if they had that level of resolution due to the sample size in that paper, but Anita and others have followed this study up, so it would be very interesting to know if someone, I'm pretty sure that wasn't in that paper, but it might be in subsequent papers. Because of course, as soon as this was discovered, this suddenly kind of creates a new science of group intelligence, right? So there could be papers out there that do that. One would predict, of course, that if people are talking over each other, it might be a bad thing, but it could also be a good thing, because if you're sort of excited about something and you're working together, you can talk together at the same time without necessarily interfering with other people's communication. So I don't know about that subtlety, though.
Well, these tasks that they use to evaluate collective performance, they are related to IQ, like for individuals?
No. I mean, if the tasks were performed by an individual on its own, yes. Okay. They're related to IQ. So you could predict from IQ whether people were going to be good at this task. Yes, you're right. Okay. Yeah, it's a good point, actually. Yeah, if it wasn't related to IQ, that would be problematic.
It was a kind of simple question-answer format, I suppose.
No.
Which is what IQ usually is, no?
The tasks that they were performing here?
Yeah.
No, they were quite complex, like architectural tasks, like building a bridge or playing a video game collectively. So quite sophisticated tasks. I only had two examples there, but in the paper they'll have all 10. So some of them physical tasks where you're doing stuff together, but relatively sophisticated tasks.
I wonder if there could be an analogy, for instance, to computation here in computers, like that, where you have, for instance, parallel versus sequential.
Yeah. So also, I can't remember how big these groups were, but I think it was only like 6 or 8 people as well. So I don't know how much capacity there would be, but you're absolutely right that if you sort of break a task down into modules and have different members of groups solving, that's a really interesting idea.
I don't know, maybe she haven't done this in this paper or maybe subsequently papers. They analyze the optimal size of the group.
We'll come to that later. The answer is no. Nobody knows. That's one of the most amazing things that I'll come to later on, is that we do not know how big to make groups to have them make better decisions, which I find, again, astonishing. But what they did find was that the collective intelligence increases with increasing social sensitivity of group members. And what we mean, I think I've got a figure of this in the next, yeah. So they did these tests where you get to look at the eyes of an individual, so you've got a limited amount of information, and you have to then say whether this person is playful, comforting, irritated, or bored. I actually don't know, so let's maybe see if we can infer. What do people think? How many people think playful? How many people think comforting? Irritated? Bored? Okay, so most people think playful. I'll try and figure out later which one it is. Actually, I know how to be more accurate to this. So for the women in here, how many of you think playful? How many of you think comforting? You can self-identify, because the reason I'm saying that is women are much, much better at doing this type of task than men. And what they found was that the simple result is that groups composed of women perform much better than groups composed of men. So their main finding, really, was that this social sensitivity, this turn-taking ability, was naturally exhibited by groups of women. And this has been replicated many, many times. And so really the simplest way to make an effective group decision is to compose a group of women, or predominantly women. Which is kind of interesting, you know, and it relates to this turn-taking type of behavior that I was talking about before. So I think men, we're not necessarily aware that we're even doing it, tending to say dominate a conversation or dominate a group decision. So I think there's a lot of pressure in society, you know, you get told, you know, you should be dominant, you should be, you know, if you watch TV shows, like this is really a stereotypical character of males.
I think I don't understand still the sensitivity thing, like how do you measure it, or?
You measure it with tests like this, where you get to assess the emotional state of another individual.
So you're more sensitive if you are more correct?
Yes. The more accurate you are at this test, and this is tends to be much easier for women to be accurate at these tests. Okay, so I think we'll come back to that in a bit. But you know, when we're talking about intelligence and collective intelligence and group decision making, we're often also talking about information, right? And so communication and information. But if you stop to think what information actually is, I guess some of you here will have an opinion on this. What would you say information is?
Thales answered this once, and I will try and remember his answer. It was something like the loss of uncertainty,
Yeah.
provided by a new fact.
Exactly. The removal of uncertainty, I think, is probably the best definition of what information is. But you'll see it used in all sorts of different ways, right? So we have to be quite careful when you think of, I mean, yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. So if you think then about communication, and we've talked about how important communication is, what percentage of communication do you think is gossip. That is talking about third parties who are not present. What are you saying? 70% is one guess. Does anyone else have any? Okay. You're a little bit high, but it's not far off. It's around 65%. But that's an extraordinary amount of our time and brain power where we're gossiping. We're talking about other individuals. And this is probably has been really important in the evolution of humans. But I think it's got the potential to be very dangerous in modern society, the way society actually functions and the way information can spread. And so if we look at, now this is looking at the HASDA. So it's there's very few human societies that shares the type of structure that's believed to be the sort of ancestral structure of societies. That is, relatively small groups, often family groups, interacting together. And you can imagine if this is your world, this is your society, that talking about third parties is pretty important. You know, this is where you get information about others. But there's a relatively finite number of, the information can't flow very far. It's just going to flow around within this type of community. But what about this type of community? Where you've got near instantaneous global communication. It's very unnatural. So information, I mean, again, gossip, right? It might be, we call it information, but it could be false information, right? It's not necessarily removing uncertainty. It could be spite. You could be deliberately saying something about somebody. You know, so we have to be really careful in modern society. No one knows who said this, but some people people have attributed it to different people, but no one really knows. But it's an expression: a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. And this is true. Lies spread really fast, right? And you can imagine in that small society that you can inoculate lies with truth eventually. But in modern society, that might be much, much harder. And so people have been now studying on these online social systems the spread of true and false news, or fake news, as Donald Trump calls it. And it turns out that false news or fake news spreads much faster and further and deeper in social networks, which again is quite scary. Now, why do you think that might be the case?
Well, because they are more appealing, like they call more attention, they usually claim bold claims and...
So why does it, so you're on the right line, so why does it get more attention, do you think? Why would people give that more attention?
Because they are not interested in small changes, they want to know the big things and I guess that's it.
Does anyone else have to add to that? Yeah, of course.
I think they are more digestible.
Okay.
They are easy to understand.
I think in general, false news are related with more drama. So
More drama, yeah. People like more drama, yeah, you're both right. Does anyone else have any other thoughts?
Maybe because of, like, emotional content, like you're always outraged by most things.
Exactly. I think you were all thinking about the same thing, but really it's the emotional state that it arises in people that seems to be the most important aspect. So it inspires fear, disgust, surprise, these types of strong emotions. And if you want to inspire these types of strong emotions, there's nothing easier to do that than making something up. by being false, it's much more likely to be surprising because it's false, right? And so if we think about that in our lives, this is quite worrisome because it means that lies told about people or exaggerations. Maybe someone says something about someone, and then when you tell the story, I know many people, it's like take a number, triple it, then tell the story. You know, they exaggerate. So, and then, you know, once it's passed down before 4 or 5 people, it's been quite heavily distorted, right? And of course, the more surprising it is, and the more emotionally arousing it is, the more likely it is to spread and spread faster, but the less likely it is to be true. So be really careful when you hear gossip, because it's much more likely to be a lie than it is to be true. And of course, the truth doesn't have the time in modern society to catch up and inoculate these lies. And sometimes they don't even bother to try, because if a lie has spread so far, it's just not worth it. You can't then, and we've got examples of this in society, that people have collectively false beliefs about factual information. I mean, one of them is, I find quite surprising, but it's called the Mandela effect, that people believe Nelson Mandela died in prison. Does anyone here believe that? I've never heard anyone that believes this, but it's a genuine effect. But he was released from prison. So what do you think we're looking at here? Exactly. But this is why I find it so surprising. But there's large swathes of the population that have a false memory or a false belief about it. And I've not met a single person that has that false belief, so that's why I was kind of asking.
I have heard of this thing before, but as you said, I've never known anyone who believes that, so sometimes I start to think if the
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's an interesting meta effect, right? We've now got an effect that actually, you know, it's on Wikipedia, it's, you know, but it isn't actually based on anything. I mean, it's quite, humans are so interesting, I would say, yeah. So what do you think we're looking at here? The colors give you a bit of a clue. Yeah. So this is Democrats and Republicans on a social network. I believe this is Twitter, but it doesn't really matter which social network. I'm pretty sure it's Twitter. And so you can see extreme polarization between these groups. Right? And if I think about it, you know, if I meet someone and they're Republican, when I lived in America, I actually have a problem with it. And that's not good either, right? That I instinctively make prejudgments about somebody. But then you also, another thing we're not going to go into today, but I find kind of fascinating, is how opinions become correlated, like abortion, people's views on abortion rights, is correlated with arms, like guns, and things like that. You know, you get these like really strong correlated opinions forming. And so, but it's understandable. But if we think about human society in recorded time, was it always like this? Do you feel that the world has become more polarized, less polarized? How do you feel things have changed in your lifetime, or from speaking to your parents or others?
I don't know, people say that we are becoming more polarized over the world, but here in Brazil, I don't know, we have been polarized since a long time ago, so
Yeah.
I don't know, since we have a dictatorship here, we have been polarized a lot before.
That's really interesting, isn't it? That you can have these sudden transitions in societies due to coups or you know, sudden changes like that. Yeah, it's a really good point.
I I think the thing now is that we have more ways to quantify and measure these kinds
Yeah.
of interactions, and also there are more ways to spread the information, because when Nicole was talking about the dictatorship, it didn't affect the same way in every region of Brazil, because from what I talked to with my grandparents and my parents, the experience that they have in a very small remote city was very, very different from people who
Yeah.
are in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. So I think that's one of the things. The information is getting more spread. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, it's going to get to you, and we have
Yeah.
ways to measure this
Yeah.
interaction.
Both very good points. I'll just pass this back.
Well, I was also trying to think about the Colombian case, and I think we have been polarized long ago in different circumstances, but what I see now is that it's easier to form echo chambers because you decide what to consume. Before it was not possible because you only watched the TV or you have the newspaper and you didn't decide what to find, and now you can decide.
Yeah, I think you're making really excellent points. And one of the things, though, I think with what you were saying about the modern communication in society is, you can, if you've got a weird belief, you can find someone else out there that's going to share your belief. Right? Do you know these famous experiments where it was just I can't remember who did these experiments, but they're sort of famous psychological experiments where you've got to say which of these lines is shorter than the others. And of course, people will always say this one's shorter. But if you have actors within the group, and you're, say, the last to take the turn, and they say that this one is shorter, or that this one is shorter, people tend to conform, which is really weird and scary. Unless one other individual agrees with you, then you will retain your original belief, right? So just being able to find rare opinions online could turn out to be really important. And similarly, there's these famous experiments by Stanley Milgram with appearing to electrocute people. And if people were told by someone in a lab coat, a figure of authority, to electrocute this person, they would do so. The vast majority of people would do so, to the point that this person appeared to be in severe distress. It's really, really weird. But some people have called those studies into question, but because they can't be replicated. There's no way you would get permission to replicate these studies nowadays. Okay, so you were talking about the quantification. So this is by no means indicative necessarily of the whole of society, but these are, sorry, the dates are very small. I can't even read them from here, but I think we're looking at late 1940s at the top there, down to 2011. And believe me, since then it's become even more polarized. This is the Congress in the United States, and it represents bipartisan collaboration on, basically you're put in parliament for the people. You should be serving the people. But as you can see in American society now, people basically vote along party lines. There can be like one vote in it, in the majority of the House. But it didn't used to be like that. There was much more collaboration, much more bipartisan communication. And so at least in American politics, the polarization can be quantified and has become very, very different than it ever was in history.
Is there some evidence regarding why bipolar polarizations tend to appear? Because if you thought of, for example, finding unusual opinions, rare lines of thought on the internet by connecting people from very different places, you could have many groups with very different opinions who now withstand the pressure to change their opinions because they have all this alongside. And in the case of American politics, there's a long history of bipartisan, but in countries such as Brazil, for example, the bipolar polarization appeared even though we for a long time had more than two major actors in
Yeah.
labor unions.
So you make a really interesting point, and I don't know enough about it to comment really reasonably, but I do wonder why in many countries, like in the United Kingdom, for example, you sometimes have a third party that can be strong, but often it's not very strong. Often in the US, it's basically just two. In Israel, there are many parties, which is why they find it so hard to form a government. And so it's interesting to me why in some countries, and maybe it relates partly to the voting system, but it could also be very cultural. You know, like in Israel, for example, the religious groups tend to, you know, have their own parties and so on. So, but it's a very interesting point. I wish I knew, I wish I knew more to comment on that. So how does this impact collective decision making, this type of polarization? Sorry, was there another? Sorry.
It was more towards like this type of experiment or echo chambers. Like there's a positive reinforcement, right?
Yeah.
Like someone that's like politically close to you, you will like value their opinion. Is there evidence of like a contrary effect? I mean, if I am a Democrat and a Republican say something, instead of like thinking about it, I like go further into my own beliefs.
There is. I saw a talk by somebody recently where they actually, I think they published a paper on it in PNAS, where there is that repulsion as well. You can actually, which is also, you know, kind of, you have to be kind of careful about bridging this polarization because it's very easy to increase it because of this kind of, so there's like an attraction to those who have similar views and a repulsion from those who have different views. Yeah, it's a really important point. And so when Donald Trump was elected, you know, my group, of course, works on collective behavior, and we were sort of shocked and thinking to ourselves, well, you know, we put all of our dedication into studying how fish make decisions. Why don't we, or ants, you know, why don't we actually think a bit about how humans make decisions? And so I haven't updated my slides, but this paper came out a few weeks ago. So if you're interested, we can share it. So what we did was we, in the US, we looked at a very large cohort, thousands of people, where we could assess whether they were very liberal to very conservative. And by very conservative, we're talking the far right. We're talking very, it's a big very. It's just we didn't want to be confrontational in the publication. And so we controlled for educational attainment and all those other things which of course could influence decisions, because no one had really studied how political views were related to decisions that are non-political. So,
and by very liberal, what is meant?
Very liberal is far left, so far right to far left. Yeah, so the extremes are quite extreme. Yeah. And what we did was we asked people many, many different questions that were not political. Things like, what's the state capital of New Jersey? Or what's the perimeter of Switzerland? And I don't know. There's like questions that really didn't have anything to do with anything. And as you can imagine, for all individuals except for the far right, or for the very, I keep saying far right, very conservatives, as you can imagine, the more accurate people were, the more confident they were that they were correct in that, except for the far right, where there was a negative response. The more confident they were in their opinion, the more likely they were to be incorrect, like factually incorrect. And so we didn't believe it, so we did it again, and we got the same results. So the far left, you can see, do not have that response. We don't know why this occurs. We couldn't really come up with a rational reason why this occurs. But another thing we noted was that when individuals have access to social information, if you have low confidence in your opinion, and then you get the opportunity to revise it based on the opinion of others, you will tend to revise it, right? And this brings up your intelligence. So all of the groups did this, except for the far right, who would only pay attention to social information if it agreed with them, which of course erodes completely the benefits of collective intelligence. I don't know if I have the figure here, but we also then looked at how, if you then have decisions being made or opinions forming on social networks, and we could change the polarization on the social networks, like how strongly connected you were by political views from at the top there, you're equally connected to everybody. At the bottom, you're very strongly polarized by political views on the social network, like in reality. And we found that even a relatively small proportion of the far right could bring down the collective intelligence of other conservatives. They have a disproportionate effect on other conservatives. You know, so again, you know, quite alarming that they could have such a negative influence on non-political things. This is just facts. And so, you know, we started this pre-COVID, but there's lots of interesting things about, you know, how people, like vaccine refusal or things like this, how they tended to spread. And often the lies and they just spread very rapidly on these online social networks. I don't know what the situation was or is like here in Brazil, but in Germany, it was quite, it was very polarizing in society. You know, you had people, I didn't realize this until we moved there, but almost every doctor does homeopathy. And it's like, you know, and so it was only when, you know, you go to the pharmacy to get the drug that you realize you're not getting anything. It's like, no, I want something that actually works, you know. You actually have to ask if you want to have non-homeopathic drugs. And so this huge sort of base of homeopathy and so on, that was strongly correlated then with vaccine refusal. You know, putting something toxic into your body or something like this. And it became very polarizing. In our own institute, you know, we had to fire some people because they refused to get vaccinated, and they were therefore not allowed to work with the animals, for example. You know, and it was really, people felt so strongly, and these are good people. These are really nice people, but they had this very strong views about vaccine refusal. And so I think it's really hard because there are so many correlations between all these different factors.
The vaccine refusal you had to fire in your institute were people who actually did experiments and were involved directly in science, or like?
No, actually, it was mostly animal caretakers. That they were. It was a clique of people with this reinforced view that they would not change their viewpoint. And then it became a conflict because they're then putting the burden of work on other individuals because they weren't allowed by the German government to come to work if they were not vaccinated or would not take tests. You could also come and take a test every day. The university offered free PCR testing, but they wouldn't get tested either, right? So if you're not going to get tested and you're not going to get vaccinated, then you couldn't work. I mean, this was in the early stages of the pandemic. So can we do anything about this? Well, if I had an answer to this, it would be a miracle, wouldn't it? Because on one hand, you know, it's easy to be pessimistic. I think, you know, we're all doomed until the Third World War, and then it won't matter anymore. Putin will destroy the world. But you know, perhaps we can do something about it. So if we think more positively, you know, so like if we think of just generally what we know from what I've taught you, what I've been teaching in this week, you know, there are some things that we can do to try to encourage smart decision making, right? So some of this we'll go through. So remember the uninformed individuals, you know, acting as a sort of form of social glue, and that's Rand Paul and the crazy Republicans. You know, I do think that, so this paper came out afterwards where they tested this idea with humans, making simple, admittedly simple online collective decisions, and they found that adding uninformed individuals improved the accuracy of these decisions. And I think as we discussed, I think yesterday, you know, they form a social glue. They allow at least a possibility for these two extreme sides that don't want to talk to each other, don't want to, as you said, don't even want to think about each other, or even, you know, they allow some form of communication. And I think in human societies, we often exclude individuals that don't have strong opinions from decision making. They often don't volunteer themselves. They're not going to run for parliament. They're not going to be, you know, necessarily volunteer to be parts of decision-making entities. But I think it's important that we increase diversity within these types of groups. So uninformed or unbiased individuals can improve collective decision making. And this is not absolutely for sure, but I think it's well worth trying, and I think further scientific studies need to look into this. Right, so what else makes for a smart group? So remember we talked about the average intelligence and this obsession that we have with individual IQ. And yes, Einstein was a rare example of someone who on his own really achieved great feats, but this is very rare. And so we really have this obsession with the individual. And as we know from that previous study, collective intelligence doesn't relate to individual intelligence. So groups with more women make better decisions. And also training men, or allowing men to be informed that when they are dominating conversations, because I'm sure I've done it and I'm just not aware that I was doing it, you know, but somehow we need to be better informed about how to communicate better within groups. So we know why. I'll just... I mean, this is what you see if you go to the business section in a bookshop, right? You know, how to live life on your own terms and be the alpha you've always wanted to be. You know, I was watching on the plane this terrible show called Suits, like what's the name Meghan Markle is in, and it's astonishing how this idea is just absolutely indoctrinated into people's beliefs that, you know, you've got to be the alpha. And I think this is a toxic type of environment to be in. Become a winner, not a whiner. I didn't see that. Yeah, you don't see any about being, you know, good in a collective decision-making context. I can tell you that. Maybe there's a role for me to write a probably very unpopular business book. So, in general, groups become dumb if one or two people dominate the conversation, even if they're smart people. What about group size? The point was made earlier. I think this is absolutely astonishing that we have no idea what group size we should be adopting. So Albert Cow, who's now at University of Boston, just started his lab this year. We tried to study this, at least theoretically, but there's tons more needs to be done. But we found that across a whole range of tasks, we predicted actually relatively small groups to be better. You know, there are these, and I think we kind of, as human societies, you know, there's expressions like too many cooks spoil the broth. I don't know if you have a similar expression in Brazil. I think we have a sense that, you know, too big is there's inefficiencies to it. But we still haven't really figured out what group sizes to be. And also, you know, if you're in big organizations, then maybe having modular groups, subsets, is a good thing. So I think, you know, thinking about certainly less than 10 individuals in these subgroups is probably a good idea, but more science needs to be conducted. And, you know, if we're thinking about structuring organizations, you know, this idea that Albert and I looked into where, you know, actually having modules of decision-making entities that are not completely isolated from one another. They do have communication, but you've got tighter communication within the modules. So we looked at different types of modularity in hierarchical structures. And so I think there's a lot more we could do. But again, we found that these relatively small subgroups, like having multiple small subgroups, performed the best, at least theoretically. And so, you know, there's much, much more that we need to do. But I also find it quite exciting because, you know, there's so much work to be done in collective behavior. So in the last few minutes, I just wanted to advertise Constance more or less. I'll just tell you a little bit about what we're doing in Constance. I know at least one of you has actually lived in Constance, but you're more than welcome to come to visit. So we're really close to Zurich Airport, so it's the main airport. This is not touched up or anything. This is actually the color of the lake. I mean, it's completely, like, I couldn't believe it when I was in Princeton. I had this whole room for treating the water for my fish. And I said, what do you do in Constance? Oh, we just use the tap water. And I went, no, you don't. and then, so I spent 2,000 euros to get the tap water tested because I didn't believe them. And it was absolutely, there's no reason to buy spring water in this city. So it's a beautiful old city because it's on the border of Switzerland. It was also not bombed during the war, so it's this beautiful historical city. I used to live in a 700-year-old house. So yeah, so it's a good place to go. University is less attractive, I would say, but it's a modern reformed university, so it doesn't have the hierarchical structures of typical German universities, which I like. This is an old picture. Our building is not even on there yet, but it's a very beautiful location. And so also the German government is very generous in funding organismal biology or fundamental research. When I put this grant in, they have a preview where they look at it just to correct things for you. And they made me take out all of the stuff where I was writing about how collective behavior could help society, could cure cancer and all this kind of stuff. Said, no, it's got to be fundamental research. And I was so different in the UK or the US, where everything has to be what's it going to do for humans. So we had funding for 7 years, and we're already beginning to plan the renewal. We've got about 85% chance of this being renewed. And so this kind of brings collective behavior sort of across the university as a common theme. And that's another advantage of being a small, oh, that's my t-shirt that you saw the other day. That's another advantage of this. And so there's 3 of us that run this. I'm the biologist. Oliver Deussen is a computer scientist who was actually nominated for an Oscar for his work in computer science. And Wolfgang Gastmeier is a psychologist, a social psychologist. And we have a range of different disciplines. Actually, now we also have philosophy, but we have biology, computer science, economics, psychology, physics, social science, maths, all related to collective behavior. And in addition, it's kind of a miracle, we also got another 32 million to build the world's first building for collective behavior. So typically when you go to universities, the physicists are still in physics, the mathematicians in math, biologists, biology. So here we actually have all of these disciplines together. We have all the labs there. And we have a pretty nice view. This is just taken from my phone. That's the view from my office, which is unbelievable. So do feel free to come. We've got funding for visitors. We have a visiting program. So if you think it would be useful to you, just get in touch. This is an old picture. This is now fully operational, but this is a 15 by 15 by 8 meter, we call it an imaging hanger. And we can track up to 100 animals at 300 times per second at sub-millimeter precision in full 3D in this space. So we're doing a whole bunch of different experiments in this. So we're working with Ahmed Al-Hadi, who moved recently from Princeton, where we're doing non-invasive neural imaging of rats foraging over naturalistic scales. We've worked with, in this case, with starlings. I mentioned this the other day. It's not like huge flocks of starlings, but groups of 15 individuals. We can also record, we have 3D sound localizations. We can record when they're producing sounds and all sorts of other aspects of communication. I've been working with Fumihiro Kano, who's now a group leader with us, where we can reconstruct the visual fields of these pigeons with very, very high precision. And we've actually found that people didn't believe that pigeons had a similar perception to mammals or to primates. We've actually shown that's not correct. If you get the data accurately enough, they also have very similar types of saccades and behaviors. So you can also, this is us reconstructing the field of view of a pigeon to try and see what it's seeing. That technology is very, very expensive, as you can imagine. So we're also investing a lot in making very cheap technology. So using the very expensive tracking technology to train deep neural networks to do it just with cell phones or with very, very cheap equipment. We're also collaborating with psychologists in this particular experiment. They're looking at how people influence each other's eating behavior, which is something we may do over lunch. And also, again, recording how people are communicating, how they're synchronizing their eating behaviors, and so on. We also study in the wild. So we have a Department of Migration that I've been collaborating with for years. This is a study we've been doing of migrating storks. These are real data, but we've, of course, animated the birds. And some of you may notice that you can even see the flapping of some of the individuals. That's because the accelerometers allow us to tell when the birds are flapping their wings and when the birds are gliding, which can give us insights into the energetics of the animals. And using solar-powered tags, we can actually track these animals across their full migration into sub-Saharan Africa. And there's huge mortality due to humans. In Europe, this is often electrocution on pylons. In Africa, it's hunting. And so these populations are in quite steep decline. And so that's another reason that we're studying these animals. And so it's pretty amazing. You can get this very high, precise movements of the birds. We also have used the birds to give us insights into the air conditions, because the birds get buffeted by the winds in the thermals. So we've been able to reconstruct the three-dimensional structure of thermals from the birds' motion themselves, from the gliding behavior. We've also looked at how they make decisions when to leave a thermal and looking for the next thermal. And as I said, scaling to continental scales. And we've found that, as I predicted, there's a small subset of individuals that guide the others during these migrations. And so here you can see two individuals. The one individual will tend to leave the thermal, will get to the top of the thermal or will leave the thermal, and then the followers tend to be forced to leave the thermal early, but they have the huge benefit of not having to search for the next thermal. So it seems to be a frequency-dependent strategy. We've also been working in the wild in Africa, using drones to do three-dimensional imaging of the environment and also tracking animals. So there's lots of problems with putting collars or putting tags on animals. You have to catch the animal, you have to tranquilize the animal, you have to have a big team of vets and so on, and we've done this, but it's very problematic, and it's actually also impossible to get the permission for endangered animals. And they're the ones that are most at risk, they're the ones we most need to understand. So we've been studying an extremely endangered species of zebra called the Grevy's zebra, and this is again all captured using drones. The environment, we have the full 3D structure of the environment as well. And this is a beautiful animal, and there's only 2,000 adults left in the world, and so this is the largest population. We're also even able to identify them from the stripe patterns now from the drones, so we can do surveying. And of course, you can get much more detailed behavioral information from these drones than you could possibly get from GPS. And so trying to understand how these animals make decisions and how humans impact, and also the variability. The droughts now occurring in East Africa are really staggering. So it's very, very hard for the animals. And this also creates a tension with humans who have livestock that they need to, so we also need to incorporate humans in the loop. And so hopefully over the last week, hopefully it's partly been a bit of fun, and suddenly been really wonderful to teach you about the cannibalistic crickets, about fish schools, and about human crowds. And so thanks very much. It's been a terrific week. Thank you.
Iain, we thank you very much for coming here and teaching the students. It has been amazing, so thank you very much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Let's take a group picture now.